We pick up where we left off from last time, talking about the Great Depression, and now we're going to be dealing with this sort of interim period where we're going to talk about U.S. foreign policy and a lot of what's going on in the rest of the world and how it's going to influence the United States, and also a little bit how the United States is going to influence the rest of the world, especially through the policy of isolationism. I told you guys not to forget that, but we'll be talking about it in a lot more detail. Well, that's now. So this section, we're going to be dealing with how the United States gets involved with World War II, how World War II starts, and then why the United States gets involved with this. And then run up to, eventually, U.S. involvement with the bombing at Pearl Harbor. So the backdrop for all of this that's going on in the rest of the world following World War I is going to be a rise of a system of government that we often refer to as totalitarianism. And it's a sort of big word to have to try to spit out. But the root of all this is total. And the reason that it gets this name is because the idea is that the state comes first. Whatever the country, whatever the nation is, that it comes first and individuals don't really matter, and that the state should have total power, total control over what all is going on. And so this is where this comes from. You're going to have governments like the fascist government in Italy with Mussolini, the Nazi government with Hitler in Germany, the communist government under Stalin, the militarist government under Emperor Hirohito and Prime Minister Tojo in Japan. So those are good examples of those kinds of things. And the reason for this is you're going to see this continual decline of these countries, many of them, like Germany and like Italy, that had been democratic republics, that are going to slide into a totalitarian type of government. And this type of government, usually you got some kind of dictatorship. Japan is a little bit muddier, but the other three major examples is you're going to have dictatorships. And they have the total power, right? Now, we would like to think that, well, people aren't going to put up with this. They must have used some kind of like military to crack down on these people. And there'll be a little bit of that, but generally speaking, the people in these countries, they acquiesce to this, all right? Because these governments seem to offer stability in a very unstable world. Many people were destabilized by the actions of the First World War and then the subsequent economic depression that really cracked down hard on them. A good example of this here is what takes place in Germany compared to the United States. In 1933, U.S. unemployment was 25%. In Germany, it was 33%. So in a lot of places, it was even worse than it was in the United States. And desperate times make people do desperate things. We're also going to see that many of these countries, like Czechoslovakia, like Germany, the Weimar Republic, like Italy, these were relatively young democratic nations, meaning that they hadn't been a democratic republic since like the 1770s, like you see in the United States. Many of them, for example, in Germany, had only become independent, independent from a monarchy in 1918. So they'd only been independent for like a decade and 15 years when Hitler takes power. So the idea that it's this time-honored tradition that people will select their own rulers, in some of these places, democratic elections were kind of a new thing. And then they get these elections and the people get elected and then the country goes into the toilet. And so they're going to conclude, yep, democracy's stupid. We don't like it. And so that's going to be their perspective on this. Right? So I've got a series of case studies. I've got kind of the four major ones to deal with. The first of these, that's going to kind of start the earliest, is in Japan. In Japan, you've got a really confusing government because nobody's actually sure who's running anything. You've got, ostensibly, at the top of this, you've got the emperor. You've got Emperor Hirohito. But how exactly do you run things? What do you do? What do you not do? And Hirohito himself kept this relationship that he had with the government intentionally muddy, that they weren't exactly sure who was running what. There were several theories. Many of them gave the emperor plenty of power. One of them was the idea that the emperor is the brain and the rest of the country is the body. But he didn't like that because that sort of put some limits to what he could and what he couldn't do. And then other ones, were saying, well, the emperor has to be totally in charge of everything. And he didn't like that because that meant he had to take responsibility for everything. So it was a really kind of confusing situation. So what you got is various sort of sectors of the political movements inside Japan that are all kind of at each other's throats. You've got some people that really want some liberal reform. They want elections, they want civil liberties, that kind of thing. And then you've got communists that are coming in and trying to take over that country. You've also got militarists, people that think that the country should serve, an ever-expansionist military. What's going to happen here is the militarists are the ones that are going to kind of win this power struggle within Japan. And Hirohito is going to give his not necessarily very vocal, at least not to the outside world support, but he's one of the, yeah, these are the guys that I want to see run. And basically what they do is they work out this deal with the liberals that, hey, we're not going to allow the communists to take over, but you've got to allow us one thing and to allow us to run things. And it's very, very evident by the time that you're going to see the ascendancy of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who was a militarist, to the top positions within the civilian Japanese government. So what you're going to see here is, in many cases, the parts of the Japanese military are just simply going to go off on their own hook. And they're going to try to justify military funding from the government by getting themselves, and thus their nation, embroiled in several world wars, most notably with China. First, they're going to attack and invade Manchuria on a pretext that the Chinese actually attacked them first, and then eventually they're going to instigate another one of these little international incidents that takes place near a bridge in northern China, and then they're just going to invade the rest of China, and this is going to get them involved in this massive war. Well, what about the rest of the league? I thought that they weren't supposed to do this kind of thing. Didn't Harding and Coolidge and these guys work out some isolationist deals where the League of Nations was supposed to prevent these people from acting aggressively? Yeah, they're supposed to, but the problem is nobody really wants to go to war again with China or with Japan or with anybody. And the League is going to protest Japan's actions, and they're going to tell you, Japan, you really shouldn't have done that. So Japan's response is, well, fine, we're out of the League, see you later. And there really isn't anything that anybody does about that. This is Emperor Hirohito, and as you can tell, pretty strong military influence on this guy. He's wearing his military uniform, but he's a monarch, right? I mean, they're supposed to do this from time to time. They're also the leader of the military. He's got the sash and the sword and the medals. I don't know that he really did anything to earn those medals, but whatever, you're the monarch, you get to wear whatever you want. Now, this guy, on the other hand, this is Hideki Tojo. This is a guy who's supposed to be head of the civilian government, and this civilian, he's not dressed like a civilian. He's dressed like a military guy, and that's not an accident. So, looking at a couple of other of these examples, in Italy, what you're going to have is the Depression is going to hit particularly hard in the 1920s. It's caused major economic dislocation. You're going to have the industrial workers that are out of work. You're going to have the farmers that are having trouble getting their goods to market. And into this is going to come one of these guys, Benito Mussolini, at the head of a group called the Fascists. And the Fascists, the fascio, right, is this bundle of sticks that the Roman senators and proconsuls and stuff like that would carry around as a symbol of their office. But the fascio was also the stick that you used to tap goats and stuff on the butt to get them to move towards the market. And this is the idea that they're going to smack the Italian people in the bottom if they need to in order to get them to move in the direction that they want to. Once he gets himself sort of weaseled into power, and he does it mostly just by whining, the king finally, he had the power to appoint people to be prime minister. And Mussolini comes in, I demand to be made prime minister, or you're going to have all these problems. He expected the king to say no, because he was a really annoying kind of guy. But the king, Mussolini, you're driving me. Okay, fine. You don't like how things are going? Fine, you are prime minister. Go ahead. Yay! Right, Mussolini, he turns to, he thought he was going to have to start a riot, but he comes out and tells the guys, I'm going to be prime minister, we're going to do things our way, right? He used a great deal of brutality to enforce all the changes that he wanted to do in terms of domestic restructuring. He would send in the brown shirts, and you guys can probably figure out why they're called the brown shirts, because they wore brown shirts. But they would go in, and political movements that were against them, they didn't do what like we do now, where you have these debates on television or on the internet or whatever. I'm right, no, you're wrong. And they didn't do ad buys of why the other side's wrong. They just sent people in there and they would beat them up. In some cases worse, right? But Mussolini understood that the Italian people aren't going to put up with sort of being pounded on forever. And so he wanted to turn towards expansionism to sort of whip up nationalist sentiment. And to do that, he's going to invade the last uncolonized part of Africa, which is Ethiopia. It's in the eastern part, the eastern horn of Africa. And he's going to take it over. Ethiopia, one, it occupies a little bit of a strategic location at the mouth of the Red Sea, but also it does have a little bit of oil that's there. Not like Saudi Arabia or Iraq or anything like that, but it does have a little bit of oil. And they're going to get some sanctions, all right, from the League of Nations. They're going to say, hey, Italy, you should have done that, right? So we're going to levy some sanctions on you. And so Italy's like, forget it. Screw you guys, right? We're going to leave the League of Nations, and we don't care what you guys think. Haile Selassie, who was the king of Ethiopia at this point, he manages to escape Ethiopia before the Italians get a hold of him, and he goes to the League of Nations to plead for somebody to intervene and actually save Ethiopia from being conquered by the Italians. And they, sorry, we really want to fight another war. We'll work on it. And Selassie says at the League of Nations, today it is my country. tomorrow it will be your country. And it turns out that he is absolutely right. Mussolini was tough, though. Mussolini was tough on his own people. His saying was about fascism and how it worked. He says, Italy requires work, peace, and calm. I will give this with love if possible, by force if necessary. So there you go, right? Now the Soviet Union, last we talked about Russia, was at the end of World War I, and the communists had taken over in a violent revolution in late 1917 and on into early 1918. And this had left the Bolshevik Party, the Communist Party, in charge. Now the guy in charge of this was Vladimir Lenin. He was a pretty popular guy. I mean, I don't know that everybody in Russia loved him, but he was widely recognized as somebody who really believed in communism and socialism and how it was supposed to work. And he led the country on these. They tried to restructure their private, capitalist economy towards a communist society, and it runs into a lot of problems. They kind of back up. They come up with a new economic plan, and they're going to try to then phase in communism rather than do it very, very quickly. And they're looking at this here, but in the early 1920s, Lenin is going to die. Well, one of the things you don't have as a dictator is a vice dictator. Like we've got a president and we got a vice president, and we know that hey, if anything happens to the president, like he's in a plane crash or God forbid, like an assassin gets him or something like that, we know well we've got somebody else right there that can step in, and this has happened at various points throughout American history. That we won't miss a beat. We've got another person ready to go as president. Well, you don't have a vice dictator where you tell them, hey, if anything were to happen to me, this guy is going to have total power because that guy's just going to shoot you on national TV because once he's the dictator, who's going to come after him, right? And so what you're going to have with Lenin's death is a great deal of political tumult in Russia, where different forces are kind of vying to see who is going to take his place. A lot of people assumed that it was going to be Leonid Trotsky, who was kind of Lenin's #1 student. He was really a great thinker about communism, but they underestimated one of the thug elements within the Communist Party, and that was this guy named Joseph Stalin. Stalin's an interesting kind of guy. He had originally studied to be a minister, but he'd gotten out of that and he'd gotten into the political movements. And the Stalin itself, of course, is a made-up last name. It sounds Russian, to us that don't speak Russian. But Stalin literally in Russian translates to man of steel. Okay, that would be like if I changed my name to I'm Joe Superman. You get your name changed to Superman. Yep, I'm Superman. And so people would sort of okay, yeah, that sounds all right. But to him, I guess he thought that Joseph Man of Steel sounded pretty tough, but. He's the one that's going to rise to the top, not through his own sort of brains and the ability to understand communism, but just through straight out thugging Trotsky's forces. And so he is going to use the machinery of the police state to seize and then maintain power. If you crossed him, the KGB showed up at your house in the middle of the night, they either shot you or they hauled you off to Siberia, and you either conformed or you died. And actually, a lot of people both conformed and died because this forced industrialization program that he puts people through is going to cause a lot of economic dislocation and some starvation and some death and some famines. But he said that, Soviet Union, we're going to industrialize. We need industry, we need steel, we need bullets, we need chips, we need planes, we need tanks, and we're going to have a lot of it, and you're going to do what I say, and if you don't like it, then pow, pow, pow with this. So here's Mussolini, right? You'll notice a recurring trend with these fascists and dictators and stuff like that is they continue to appear in their military uniform. And so this is him visiting their North African colonies in Tripoli. And of course, they're all giving him the big salute there. And there he is making this big bombastic speech. And so this is one of the things that they're good at, was this. And so there he is at a rally, and he's giving the fascist salute, which is a little bit different than the Nazi salute. But I guess there's various gradations of where your arm goes, depending on what kind of dictator douchebag you are. This is a pretty popular scene of Soviet propaganda, right? Where you've got, this is our beloved Vladimir Lenin. And Lenin, by the way, he's still embalmed in Red Square. So for those of you that want to see a corpse, if you're into that kind of thing, you can still go to Moscow today and they'll show you Lenin's body. I don't know, maybe someday it'll rise from the grave like in a zombie revolution or something. But anyway, the reason that this is propaganda from the Stalinist period is they're sitting around talking all kind of communist brilliance. They believe in central planning, that a few of these guys can get together and sort of make the economy do whatever they want it to do. And Stalin's getting up like, let me tell you something, Chief. This is really what I think should go on. And it establishes the idea that, well, Stalin's a thinker, and Stalin really learned a lot from from Lenin, and so this is why we should follow Stalin now that Lenin is gone. The reality was, I don't know how much time Stalin really spent learning from Lenin. I mean, Stalin was for the most part the thug that was running the dirty underbelly of the communist regime. And so, but you see a lot of this propaganda. This is the man of steel. He's tough. You don't mess with him. And he's got the great big caterpillar mustache action kind of going on. And there he is as the leader of all the various ethnic groups of the Russians inside the Soviet Union with all manner of dress and facial features and whatnot. And of course, Stalin was like 3 times as tall as anybody else, which is sort of creepy. And I guess his chest itches too because he's got his hand in his shirt. Of course, I know why you guys tuned in today, and that's to talk about Nazis. You've seen enough Indiana Jones movies to know that the real interesting group of people here are the Nazis. I mean, if you ever wanted to see a living, breathing, honest-to-God comic book character villain, it's Adolf Hitler, And so we've got to explain why this happens. A country of usually, generally speaking, fairly level-headed, efficient, kind of hard-working people. The Germans could go for a guy that, he pounds on the table and he makes these wild, kind of speeches. Why would they follow this guy? Especially when he's saying things like, we need to go to war again. Really? This is what happens, okay? When you look at what life was like inside Germany, if you put yourself in the shoes of the average German following World War I and what happens to them in the interwar period, you can understand at least a little bit of what is going on, and that is the fact that Germany is absolutely prostrated by World War I. When the First World War is over, they've thrown all of their resources into fighting the war, and of course they lose. All right? A lot of people were, they were wondering if they were going to survive the winter of 1918, 1919, because they put everything into the war effort, and there maybe weren't going to be enough resources left. But then when the Versailles Peace Treaty rolls around, it says, hey, you guys, you owe us a bunch of money for fighting the war. We don't have any money. No, you got to pay us. Okay. But by the way, you're also going to lose all your overseas colonies, so your ability to make money is going to go down. And we're also going to carve away parts of your country and give it to places like Poland. So you're going to lose some of your own people. All right. Oh, and one more thing, right? You've got to tell everybody in the world that World War I was your fault. Well, we were involved in starting World War I, but it wasn't all our fault. Nope, it's all your fault. And then last but not least, you're only going to have enough people to form like a police force, so that if anybody else attacks you, then you just march right into Germany and take you over. Needless to say, right? Germans were broke, they were desperate, and they were starting to look for revenge against the people that they thought had caused them this problem. And so the German democratic government, the Weimar Republic that had been established in the wake of World War I, it was a democratic republic. People got to vote for their own, German representatives in the Reichstag, and they got to vote for a president of Germany and all that kind of stuff. But it really has the deck stacked against it because you've got economic depression, you've got all of these problems, the fact that Germany, even if it didn't have a depression to deal with, was already going to have a number of problems just because of the fact that it had been born during this time of extreme stress on its society. So into this situation comes Adolf Hitler, all right? At the head of the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, or the NSDAP, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi, right? For short for National, right? So the Nazi Party, he starts arguing that Germany needs to move away from this failed system of democracy. Look at democracy, all this kind of crap. Germany needs real solutions, and what do politicians do? They sit in these committees and they debate with each other. We need action now. And so he says that this is a bad idea. More importantly, in terms of foreign policy, Germany needs to stop getting pushed around by the rest of the nation. They pushed us down the flight of stairs, at the end of World War I, and then they kicked us when we were down, and we need to not only get our status back, but we need to stand up for ourselves in a world and have a war of revenge against the guys that did this. And so we're going to see this is pretty fertile ground, not even necessarily a majority of Germans, but with a lot of them. Well, Hitler misplays his hand in the early 1920s. He tries to take over the government by force in one of the most ridiculously stupid takeover attempts in world history. At a beer hall in southern Germany, he captures some of the leaders of the German government, announces that the Nazis are taking over, and instead of actually marching to Berlin with his stormtroopers and taking over the government, they just start having parades down in Bavaria, and he figures, well, everybody will rally to my cause, which of course is the opposite of what happened because they just called the police and the guys showed up and they arrested him. And so he is caught and he is put on trial, But he gets some, not necessarily Nazi judges, but he gets some pretty friendly judges who they let him speak a lot at his trial. And he talks about the reason that he loves Germany, and Germany is great, and this is why he did what he did, because of his extreme patriotism. And so, because of the national media attention, all of a sudden Hitler goes from this kind of crackpot figure running around the southern part of Germany to he's saying a lot of stuff that I agree with. I love Germany, and I want to see it be successful. And so he is sentenced to prison because even in Germany, trying to take over the government is illegal. But he only gets 10 months. So he's in prison, and he's got nothing to do because they haven't invented video games yet. So he's just hanging out, and he decides to publish a book called Mein Kampf, right? Which is my struggle or my battle, right? And in Mein Kampf, you could find everything that Hitler was going to do. Hitler was actually a ridiculously honest person whenever he didn't give his word. If he promised that he was going to do something, then you could figure, well, he's probably lying, right? But if he was just spouting off crazy stuff, like, he hates the Jews and he wants to see them all wiped out, and we need to have a war of revenge against the Allies, we need to have a total takeover of the government by one strong mind and tell everybody what to do. A lot of people from the outside, they look at it and say, he's just spouting off crazy stuff to get political support. He doesn't really mean all that kind of stuff, because what kind of sane, rational person would mean that? No, if Hitler didn't say, by the way, I promise this is what I'm going to do, he meant it. He was very serious about that. And so you can see in Mein Kampf all those things that Hitler was going to do. And when it is published, it eventually becomes a bestseller, and a lot of people get a pretty good idea of what he's going to do, right? Well, when Hitler gets out of jail, he decides that the Nazi Party is going to change its tactics. It still wants to try to take over the government, but he says we're going to have to do it legally. We're going to have to get elected to the government first. Fortunately, right around this point is when the Great Worldwide Depression begins in the late 1920s. And basically, all you have to do is chart the election returns inside Germany, and every time the economy gets worse, the number of Nazis elected to the Reichstag goes up. All right. Finally, this is going to culminate here in January of 1933, where Hitler's Nazi Party, along with the Catholic Center Party, they can form a coalition that's big enough to get him the position of Chancellor, which is basically leader of the legislature of Germany. And so he is going to begin now his takeover of power. Now, soon after this, the Reichstag building, where the government meets, burned by fire. This, of course, was a plot that actually the Nazis had got to put into place themselves. They get this guy who's a little mentally unstable. He is a communist, but he's not, the elevator didn't go all the way to the top floor. And he goes in, and of course the Nazis had soaked the walls of the Reichstag with flame accelerant. So that way any small, flame would, take off very, very quickly before the fire department could come and douse it. And of course the Nazis, they catch the guy after he's done this, and they say, well, he's a communist, and he's up to no good, and so there's this massive threat of communists everywhere. And so Hitler says that there's this big emergency, and since the governmental building has caught on fire, Hitler sort of browbeats the members of the Reichstag. Now, actually, all the Nazis are going to vote for him, but he's got to convince all these other people enough to give him special legislative power, emergency legislative power, called the Enabling Act, which basically says, okay, Hitler can make whatever law he wants without having to put it to a vote of the rest of the Reichstag. And they get kind of, okay, this is the patriotic thing to do. We just had this terrorist attack, and so we're going to do this, all right? And so now Hitler can make whatever law he wants to, all right? Now, up until this point, everything that Hitler has done has been legal. Well, maybe setting the Reichstag building on fire wasn't legal, but he hasn't really gone outside the Constitution for what he's going to do. At this point, though, the president of Germany, right, because Germany's government is pretty similar to ours. You got a president who handles like foreign policy and the military and trade with other countries and stuff like that, and it kind of oversees the whole government and executes the law. And then you got the legislative branch, which at this point now, the making of the law and the setting of domestic policy, Hitler had been in charge of that. Well, Hindenburg, who by now is he's like 8,000 years old. He's like Yoda old. Okay, he's going to die. And at this point now, Hitler is going to break the Constitution, because he's going to take Hindenburg's job of the presidency, which is now vacant, and he's going to combine it with his own job as chancellor into a new position that he calls the Führer, which in German just means the leader. Okay, he's now the leader, so he has both jobs. Now at this point, he's broken the Constitution. What he's done is illegal. He's not allowed to do this. But in order to get rid of him, the Germans would have had to have a revolution against Hitler's government. And while the Nazis never probably really had a total majority of Germans that were on his side, at least at this point, there weren't enough of them that were willing to have a revolution to do anything about it. The Germans really don't like disorder. They don't like revolutions. It's not their kind of thing. And so they allow him to maintain power, and that's what's going to happen. So here we go. There's Adolf Hitler, and of course, this is the guy that ruins the half mustache for everybody forever. So, for those of you that want a really short, stubby mustache, you can't do it because everybody's like, oh, you look like Hitler. And so, anyway, that's what's going to happen here. You can see the rampant inflation of what the Versailles Treaty plus the expenditure of German resources in World War I plus the Great Depression is going to do to their currency, and that it was so valueless that children were playing with stacks of like millions of Reichsmarks as playthings. They were cheaper to use as that than actually going out and trying to buy toys or buy bread or anything like that with them. And so here you can see this is the beer hall Putsch. All right, the Putsch is the German word for coup. It's a revolution against the government. And they're look at all the happy little Nazis. They're pretty happy, and they're the truckloads of these guys, and they're pulling into Munich, and they're going to have a big party when they should have been trying to take over the government. And of course, a bunch of these guys are going to get shot a little bit later. And there's Hitler. He's in the beer hall. And he's meeting with these guys. This is, of course, a few years before the Putsch takes place. And you can see there's Hitler. He's already at the head of the table, and he's got the swastika flag, and he's got the top Nazis all around him. And of course, this is Hitler meeting with the first guy that the Nazis are going to back for president. This is a World War I general named Erich Ludendorff. Ludendorff's going to lose. Hitler would later himself run for the presidency, and he would lose until eventually he gets this position. And of course, this little animated slide gives you a good idea of kind of what the deal was with Hitler. When people outside of Germany, when they would see Hitler giving a speech, like in a newsreel or something like that, they see this nut. He's pounding the table, he's tugging at his collar, his eyes are bulging out of his head, he's just making these wild sort of flailing movements with his hand. I mean, the dude is out there, okay? And they dismiss him as what you and I would probably dismiss him as. He's a kook, he's crazy, the Germans aren't going to follow this guy. But if you were there, Hitler was a master of getting large groups of people sort of onto his page. Okay, he would start all of his speeches late, and so everybody's happy to see him when he gets there, and they erupt in applause. He would pepper the crowd with supporters to make sure that they were all cheering. Okay, and then that kind of gets everybody whipped up into what they're doing. And then by the end of this, he's using his verbal abilities to get everybody to go, "Don't you love Germany? I love Germany. You love it too." And so then he's able to start launching into his programs that no sane person really should be interested in. But by that point, people are so whipped up emotionally that he's able to really control them. All right. So what about the United States? You got all this crazy junk going on in the rest of the world. Well, the United States should be standing up against this kind of thing. I mean, when crazy crackpot countries try to get nuclear weapons, we at least try to stop them, don't we? When they do all these kind of squirrely stuff around the world and take them over, when we at least say something about it. No, we're not going to do that here. As the war clouds in Europe and Asia begin to gather, America's reaction to that was the same thing that a turtle does when it's threatened, and that's it goes into its shell. It's going to hide, okay? In fact, just to make this point as emphatic as possible, 3 times in the 1930s, 1935, 36, and 37, Congress is going to pass a series of neutrality acts that basically remind the Roosevelt administration, hey, by the way, stay out of this war, all right? Now, Congress isn't alone in this. In fact, they're reflecting what the will of most of the American people was at this point, that a lot of American citizens, they felt really betrayed by what had happened at the end of World War I, and they don't see this as a war that impacts them directly, and they want to avoid another one of these types of experiences. And so this idea of isolationism, where the United States is going to isolate itself at any cost, if necessary, was what they wanted the Roosevelt administration to follow. Well, the effect that, this is another one of those instances where, the message that you send is not necessarily the one that the other party receives. And so the message that the United States wants to send to itself and also to people around the world, we're a peaceful people, don't mess with us, we're going to stay out of your affairs, you stay out of ours. But of course the message to a guy like Adolf Hitler is, hey, we can do whatever we want because we don't have to worry about the United States getting involved. Nobody's going to stop us. We only have to worry about Britain and France, and of course they're kind of dithering right now about what they're going to do as well. Compounding this problem is the fact that these neutrality acts were very non-specific. The only thing that it recognized in any kind of war was not, hey, one of the combatants is like a Nazi fascist dictator guy, and the other is this country that's being taken over. They're a democratic republic, and they're kind of good guys, and we need to support that kind of government. They only listed what we refer to as belligerents. You're fighting them, you're fighting them, you guys are fighting each other, you're both fighting, and so we don't want anything to do with people that fight wars. When a real distinction may have helped the United States. We since try to make that distinction whenever there are conflicts around the world and say, well, is there an outcome that we care about in this regard, right? The dress rehearsal for World War II is actually going to take place here in Spain. In 1936, we're going to see that nationalist forces, essentially, they're sort of like Spain's fascists, under a guy named Francisco Franco, who was a general in Spain's army, is going to rise up in rebellion against the King of Spain. Right? Now, the King of Spain and his forces are often referred to as royalists, but that was in part influenced by the fact that the King of Spain also was in favor of a socialist government that was in charge that was getting a lot of assistance from communists from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, from Russia. The Russian communists, they wanted to see socialist communist forces remain in power, and of course, you've got Franco, who is going to eventually set himself up as a dictator, is going to start receiving aid from the Nazi and fascist forces inside Germany and Italy, respectively. Now, as far as we're in the United States concerned, U.S. neutrality is going to stay out of it. Today, we don't. Two belligerents. You got Francisco's belligerents, and you got the King's belligerents, and so we don't want to have anything to do with this, right? And so the United States is going to stay out of the war. So Franco, though, on the other hand, he's going to receive help from volunteers, and I use volunteers in quotes, from Germany and Italy, because these guys weren't volunteers. Okay, these guys weren't walking down the streets of Berlin or whatever and reading the newspaper and go, this guy Franco who's trying to take over Spain, that's my guy. I'm just going to go and I'm going to volunteer myself to be in his army and help win the Spanish Civil War. That is not what's going to happen at all. The German and the Italian high command, especially the Germans, are going to send some of their parts of their military over, parts of their air force, parts of their army, to go and help Franco win, because they understand that Franco is going to be a sympathetic government to them in Madrid if he should win the war. More importantly, the Germans at this point, they have lost World War I, and they're looking at their what had happened, and they're looking at their military that they have on hand, knowing that they're probably going to have to fight another world war here shortly, and they're going to say, okay, what do we need to do differently with what we have to work with? And so they start coming up with these new battlefield tactics, given the fact that their army had been eviscerated, and also their army lost the First World War. We're going to have to do something different. And it's easy to draw up battle plans on a napkin or something like that. Well, you just do this, you just do that. But eventually, at some point, you got to start trying this out. And they start doing these maneuvers. But eventually, at some point, we need to try it out on a battlefield with real bullets. And so, on a small scale in Spain, the Germans are able to practice these new battlefield tactics to see if they will work. And it turns out they do. They work pretty well. Okay. So, long story short, Franco, with the help of the Germans, is going to win, and he's going to set up a dictatorship. All right. Germany, though, is going to be the real winner, because it's going to get all of this invaluable experience as to how World War II is going to be fought. All right. And so here you can see a couple of examples of this. These are the royalist/communist forces inside. This is inside Spain. This is a recruiting poster, and you notice the heavy incidence of red. You get the hammer and the sickle, and these guys are being extolled to join the war effort on behalf of the king and also for socialism and stuff like that. And this is a Russian-made T-28 tank that is actually being crewed by American volunteers, legit volunteers. And these guys were American communists that went over to try to help the Spanish Royalist Party maintain control. This is the Condor Legion. These are the guys that are sent over by Hitler to, as I said, volunteer to help Franco's forces out. These are Ju-52 bombers that would eventually be converted over to supply planes. And this is Ritter Fontona, who was the commander of the Condor Legion on the ground in his Panzer I tank. And there are little questions like, hey, can entire armored formations really be that maneuverable and get around enemy formations on the battlefield and then on the broader kind of map? Yep, turns out you can. And questions like, well, it seems logical that you'll be able to bomb a city into submission from the air. Can you actually do that? Yeah, you can. And so these are the answers that the Germans are going to get with this, right? So it's becoming increasingly apparent for a lot of what's going on that it looks like Hitler is serious about provoking a war. So what do we do about that? Well, the United States isn't the only country in the world that really felt bad at the end of World War I and are willing to do whatever it takes to maintain, I hesitate to use the word peace, but at least a lack of war in Europe as a result of this. And so they develop a real peace at any price kind of mentality. And what you've got to understand here is the leaders of France and Britain and some of these other countries, by this point here in the 1930s, 20 years ago in the 1910s, they were in the trenches. A lot of these guys were in World War I. And they saw the rivers of blood and these people that were just blown to smithereens that they had known since they were children. And they were like, we're going to do whatever we can to avoid that again, because that was horrendous. And so they are going to do what is often referred to as appeasement, which is, these guys say that they're going to cause a war unless they get what they want. Well, we can just give them a little bit of what they want. That'll keep them happy. Okay? This is especially true of Hitler and Tojo's government in Germany and Japan, respectively. And so it's mostly going to be the United States that's going to appease Japan, because Japan's invasion of China is also going to come concomitantly with attacks on American civilians that are doing business in China. A lot of American property is going to get destroyed. Some Americans are going to get caught up in the fighting and they're going to get killed. A couple of American ships are going to get, civilian ships are going to get bombed. And so normally, if we think back to what happens here with the Spanish-American War in 1898, you'd say, oh, snap, kid, the Americans, they're not going to stand for this. You don't rough up Americans without getting a serious backhand slap from the US of A. But no, that's not what's going to happen. In fact, Americans demand that FDR don't do anything. Don't provoke the Japanese. We don't want to fight another war. And so just let the Japanese take over China as much of it as they will. We don't care. Okay? Now, Hitler is going to read the tea leaves, because at this point he's going to see what Japan is doing in Asia, what Mussolini had been doing in Ethiopia, and so Hitler's going to go on a series of advances here in Europe. All right. In 1935, he's going to take the Versailles Treaty and essentially flush it down the toilet, where he's going to openly rearm his military. The Versailles Treaty said that Germany can only have this really, really small military. You can't have these huge divisions. You can't, and there are some pieces of equipment that you can't have, like tanks, heavy artillery, heavy machine guns, fighter planes, submarines, all this kind of stuff. The Germans, you can't have it. Hitler says, you know what, it's my country, and unless I use the military to attack somebody else, it's none of your business. And so he openly rearms his military, and the Allies do nothing. In 1936, he's going to march his troops into the Rhineland, which is this territory around the Rhine River, which is right next to France. Part of the agreement with the French was that German troops would not be stationed right up next to where France is. And he says, look, unless I cross the border and like I try to attack France, what does it matter to you if I send troops into my own country? The Allies do nothing. In 1938, he is then going to move into German-speaking Austria, and he's going to take it over. And again, the Allies do nothing. They're starting to get pretty nervous, though, with this. And for those of you that either have studied child psychology or you've just spent a lot of time with children, when a kid says, I want something, and you say no, and they have like a temper tantrum, you say, okay, fine, here you can have a little piece of candy, okay? And then you give them another piece of candy to keep them quiet. All you're doing is reinforcing the behavior. You're rewarding them. They cry. You give them candy, okay? They're like rats, right? In this case, the rat wears this little weirdo hat and has this short little mustache, and he goes and he says, I want this, and then you give him what he wants, which is you let him keep it, okay? And so by October of 1938, Hitler is poised to move into Czechoslovakia, okay? And the reason for this is when you look at the map, by taking over Austria, you'll notice that it sort of looks like a mouth. And this is Czechoslovakia here, and they're going to be taking this over. And the reason for this is when you look on the map, this area around the border with Germany, inside Czechoslovakia, is full of all these German-speaking people. They were called the Sudeten Germans. And these are actually some like German people. I mean, they're the ones that live up in these high mountains, and they've got the little leather pants, and they got the little hat with the feather out of it, and they dance on the table, and they yodel on the mountains and stuff like that. So anyway, they felt that they were an oppressed minority group trapped inside Czechoslovakia. And so you would think, well, it's actually a pretty tiny little slice of territory. You'd think there would be a pretty simple solution to this, which is we just give the Germans the German part of this. The problem with this, okay, is almost all of Czechoslovakia is pancake flat, okay? The part that they share with Germany is got a series of rings of mountains. That mountains are pretty easy to defend. And if you just give these over to the Germans, then they'll be down into the flat territory with their military, and if they want to, with their legions of tanks and wheeled vehicles, they can just drive into the country and take it over. And so this is the problem with this, all right? And so Britain and France now, all of a sudden, they don't just acquiesce to what Hitler wants, and they say, hey, look, you can't take over Czechoslovakia. If you move in and attack Czechoslovakia, we're going to declare war, all right? Well, Hitler was totally cool with that, but then you're going to see that Mussolini and, to a lesser extent, Neville Chamberlain, the leader of Britain, are going to agree, okay, I'll tell you what, why don't we have a peace conference, okay? And they're going to get together in Munich, in southern Germany, to talk about what kind of peaceful settlement we could have with Czechoslovakia. Now, what's interesting here is Czechoslovakia isn't invited to the meeting to talk about what's going to happen to their country, all right? So Hitler gets in there when he promises Chamberlain, listen, just give me the little slice of territory around the edge of Czechoslovakia, and the Sudeten part with the Germans in it. They can be part of Germany, and that'll be cool, right? He signs an agreement, that's it, we don't want this kind of thing. And we're not going to have any more trouble. And so Chamberlain, yay, all right, he goes back, he waves a piece of paper over his head, we will have peace in our time, is one of the things that he says, okay, that Hitler promised, that he's not going to have any more territorial demands in Europe, okay? And it shouldn't surprise us that 6 months later, Hitler's tanks roll into the rest of Czechoslovakia and take it over. And of course, the Allies are too stunned to do anything about this, all right? Winston Churchill, throughout this period, is not the Prime Minister of England. And he's been telling everybody in the English government, listen, we need to do something about this Hitler guy. This guy Hitler, he's a thug, he's a gangster. The only language that he understands is the language of violence, and so we're going to have to smack him. And everybody's telling Winston Churchill, you're a warmonger, Winnie. A guy like you just want another war. What's your problem? Didn't you see the First World War? Wasn't it horrible? What's your problem? You evil, evil man. And when Chamberlain comes back from the Munich conference, Churchill said that Neville Chamberlain had a choice between war and shame. And Chamberlain chose shame, but he will have war anyway. And that is a very prophetic statement. So this is Germany. They're rearming their military. They're building these Panzer III tanks in the background. Legions and legions of German riflemen and machine gunners are marching through the streets with their brand new uniforms. This is Hitler and his forces moving into Austria. They take it over, but of course Austria is a German-speaking country. And as you can see, they're pretty happy to see old Uncle Adolf as he rolls in. We saw the maps here of Czechoslovakia. This is Hitler, Neville Chamberlain, and some of the other people, Hermann Goering, and some of the other meetings, people meeting here at Munich, where they're hashing this all out. And then there is Neville Chamberlain on his return. He's got the piece of paper. I have here a piece of paper signed by Mr. Hitler. And so this is what's going to happen. That he believed Hitler. All right. Now, part of the reason why the Allies felt still sort of confident that they didn't necessarily have to do anything about Hitler was Hitler had often openly spoken about how he hated communism, and that that Germany needed to expand eastward and take over some of these areas in Eastern Europe. And all you got to do is look at a map and say, there's Poland east of Germany, and then there's Russia east of Germany, and he says that he hates communism. And so one of the things that also the Allies hated, apart from Hitler's Nazi government in Germany, was Stalin's communist government inside Russia. And their sort of ultimate fantasy was, let's have Hitler and Stalin fight each other, and then they both destroy themselves. And then we'll let the two sort of problem children of Europe kind of kill themselves in battle. Well, Stalin wasn't having any of this, okay? He didn't want to be the foil for Britain and France to be used against Hitler, unless, of course, he had to. And so what's going to happen is Stalin is going to sign a non-aggression pact. He's going to sign a peace treaty with Hitler. And he's going to say, hey, you want to attack me? I want to attack you. You go bananas on the Allies. You rip them apart, and we'll be cool, all right? And once this happens in early 1939, a lot of people, even inside the Chamberlain government in Britain, realize, oh, we're going to have a war, okay? So throughout this period now, here in 1939, Hitler is agitating for more territory in Eastern Europe, despite the fact that he promised not to. Particularly problematic is there's a part of Poland that is in between two parts of Germany. There was the part around the city of Danzig, which is now the Polish city of Gdansk. And there was no direct land communication between the two. You could get there by boat, because they're both on the North Sea and the Baltic kind of area. But you couldn't get there on the road. And so Hitler demanded a corridor, okay? What is often referred to as the Polish corridor, all right? And he said that originally this had all been part of Germany anyway, and it was only taken away by the Versailles Treaty. Poland says, no, this is our country and you can't have it. Well, Britain and France, they say, look, if you declare war on Poland and you attack them and you invade them, we're going to declare war on you. And of course, up until this point, there's no reason to think that for Hitler to think that they're going to actually do it, but they do, okay? Because on September 1st, 1939, Hitler orders his forces to go in and attack Poland, and 2 days later, Hitler is sort of surprised when he learns that Britain and France actually did declare war on him, right? The Allies, though, they're not stupid, they just get fooled, all right? They make a miscalculation. They understand that Poland's army isn't going to defeat the Germans, okay? But Poland does have a pretty good sized army. It's got a couple of million men in its army. It doesn't have like the world's best air force, but it's got some pretty good tanks, here and there. It's got some pretty good soldiers. And so they figure, well, the Polish, because as Hitler's army is moving east into Poland, well, the western border of Germany will probably be relatively undefended, and so we can move in and attack it from the west. We should have enough time because Poland should keep the German army occupied for about 6 months. It doesn't take the German army 6 months to conquer Poland. It takes the German army 3 weeks. Britain and France are absolutely shocked by what takes place. And the reason behind this is because of the Germans' new war-fighting tactics that they had gotten a chance to think about and then eventually practice in the Spanish Civil War that British newspapers would eventually refer to as blitzkrieg, which literally translated from German means lightning war. Lightning meaning the speed at which the war is fought. Now, it's interesting to study blitzkrieg briefly because essentially blitzkrieg and how you do it, this is the way we fight our wars now in our military. We looked at what the Germans did in World War II and was like, man, that's how you do it. And we started copying it really from World War II onward. We've gotten better with technology with like satellites and laser-guided rockets and stuff like that. But generally speaking, the overall principle behind it remains the same. And the reason that the Germans come onto this is because, like I said, the German army had been whittled down to essentially nothing. Which on the one hand is a problem because you don't have anything to start with, but it's also a benefit in that you can start from scratch and say, okay, we don't have any existing military stuff right now, so we can make it whatever we want it to turn into. And so they can start building towards an immediate new goal. They also looked at the way they had fought World War I and they had tried to out-muscle the Allies. But the Allies really outnumbered them, and so in a power struggle where we sort of hurl our army versus your army, the guys with more army is going to win in that regard. So instead of power, what are some other things that we could work on? And the Germans decide to go for speed. Speed and maneuverability and the interconnectivity of different pieces of technology all working together towards the same goal, such as getting tanks, trucks, airplanes, paratroopers, radio, all of this working in conjunction with each other. And so blitzkrieg would call for massive bombardments of an enemy line only at one point, though, to create a breach, and then very, very quickly it's going to stop. The air attacks would reach into the rear area, stopping any reinforcements and also disrupting command and communications or any bridges in the rear, and then you have a breakthrough at one small point, what the Germans refer to as the Schwerpunkt, the heavy point. If it was American military terminology, would be what often referred to as the center of gravity. But it's the same sort of idea, that it's all going to hit at one point, and you're going to funnel everything towards this, and you're going to break through. But once through, these tanks wouldn't turn back and fight these guys that are on the main sort of firing position, because they all got heavy weapons. They're going to keep going. They're going to keep going towards the rear area, and they're going to start attacking the supply depots, the command centers, the railroad junctions, the roads and bridges in the rear area, and they're going to leave these guys cut off behind them. And you're going to move these guys up that are infantry in vehicles so that they can move as swiftly as possible, fan out with motorcycles and reconnaissance cars so that way you know what's going on, and then you eventually cut these guys and leave them stranded, and you're going to start heading towards the enemy rear areas as quick as possible. And so this is from a Polish tactical manual. This is a double envelopment rather than a single breakthrough kind of thing. But you've got the enemy, they're strung out on a line, they're going to defend an area, and you pick one spot and you just punch through and you keep going and you attack their rear area as quickly as possible. And so this is actually from the cover of a video game that I played. It's interesting kind of stuff because it really gets the idea of how blitzkrieg really is working. You got the tanks that are kind of at the center of all this, but you've also got guys on foot that are fighting alongside them, aircraft in the skies, paratroopers being dropped out. They're all in connection with each other via radio. One of the main pieces here, especially in the early part of the war, that the Germans had is a great tactical air force on the battlefield that was done by a number of different types of aircraft. This is the Ju-52, made by the Junkers Corporation, of a dive bomber. And it would, you could see what was going on below you. Okay, we're going to bomb here, and you could dive right on it and do a decent job of getting the ordnance, pretty close. Close enough to at least scare the mess out of people and make them abandon their artillery piece or hop out of their tank. And of course, it made a nice screaming sound. So much so, the reason for that is the Germans put these sirens under the wings to make this sound, and it would create this high-pitched kind of whine for psychological warfare. And so this is a good sort of layout of how the Germans would do this. And when they're in open country, the tanks assume the sort of the forward position because they've got all this heavy weaponry with cannons and machine guns, and they can take a lot of damage, and as long as they've got decent visibility all around them, they're pretty good. But when they get into dense terrain, such as forests and rocks and things like that, then the infantry, which are following along in half-tracks or trucks, then they come up and they assume these guard positions around the tanks, and they kind of lead the charge against things like anti-tank guns. And of course, you can see these guys that are coming up. They're in these half-tracked or wheeled vehicles, and you can see down here at the bottom left, you've got a column of tanks with infantry and motorcycles on either side of the road. And of course, a lot of their scouts were now on motorcycles with their maps in front of them. They sort of motor around and they look and they see where the enemy is, and then they jot down the map and they radio back, where the enemy is. All right, so in the early spring of 1940, because Germany's quick victory over Poland kind of throws Britain and France into a shock, and they're saying, okay, we need to see what Germany's going to do with its army because we're really kind of scared about this, and they are going to take over both Denmark and Norway to prevent the same kind of blockade of their coastline that they had to go through in the First World War. But as spring heads towards summer here in May of 1940, the real target is going to be France, all right? And to understand how Germany conquers France, all you got to do is look at a bullfight, all right? If you've ever seen a bullfight, or if you understand how this works, you've got this big bull that's actually bigger and stronger and more powerful than the matador, but he's got a couple of pieces of equipment at his disposal, and that is the cape and either a sword or a spear or something like that. When he does, he wiggles the cape, in front of the bull's like, oh, there he is, and he goes off and he steps out of the way because he's now suckered the bull into exposing himself, and he stabs it in the neck. And that's exactly what the German plan is, okay? You've got two areas between Germany and between France, along this border region. And the first of these is the neutral country of Belgium, which Germany had invaded in World War I to try to get to France because it's flat, it's open, it's got a good road system. And then to the south of that, you get the Schnee-Eifel Mountains, and you've got the Ardennes Forest, and the Allied planners are looking, okay, the Germans, they have this big army, it's full of tanks, it's full of vehicles, they're going to have to come through Belgium because it's flat, it's open, and they'll never be able to get all those vehicles on these roads here through the Ardennes Forest. And so as a result of that, the front directly across the Ardennes, near a place called Sedan in eastern France, that is pretty lightly defended, and the troops they have, they're really not the best troops that they have, whereas they pack everything in the north. And the Germans send a small sort of force, and they make a lot of noise when they head into Belgium, and the Allies, hey, there they come, here come the Germans, hide little, let's go after them. And so they head into Belgium, okay? And they are going north just as the Germans begin breaking through to their south, along the Meuse River near Sedan. Now, it's obvious that at this point the Allies, the British and the French armies they've been suckered. Okay, they got caught by surprise. Okay, and this happens several times in World War II. I mean, surprise is part of warfare. You don't tell the enemy what you're going to do, and in a lot of cases it shouldn't come as a shock that sometimes when you try to get surprised, you get it. Well, when Hitler invades the Soviet Union in June of 1941, the next year, Stalin is surprised. Okay, because Hitler had told him he wasn't going to do it, and he didn't really believe that Hitler would. I don't know why. Hitler's not exactly the most honest guy. But he knew immediately that he'd been fooled. There wasn't necessarily anything he could do about it right away, but he knew right away, okay, Hitler, he fooled me. The same is true here with the Americans, with the Japanese when they bombed Pearl Harbor. They didn't think the Japanese were going to bomb Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor's too far inside American-held territory. It's thousands of miles. They'd have to sneak in. They'd have to bomb it from the air. And, you can't bomb ships from the air, can you? I mean, not enough of them to really do any damage. But once the bombs and the torpedoes started blowing up and started sending U.S. ships, to the bottom of Pearl Harbor, they realized immediately, okay, we've been fooled. It takes the Allies it takes the British and the French 4 days to figure out that they've been fooled. By that point, it's too late. The German forces have broken through south of their position, and they start curling north, cutting them off from the rest of French territory, and is going to trap them in a huge pocket against the North Sea and the English Channel. Now, at this point, okay, you're going to see the British are going to turn to the Neville Chamberlain government and say, you screwed this all up. This is not how things are supposed to be. You said, first of all, we wouldn't have a war, and then 2, we figured, well, now that there is a war, you'll help us win it. And so they actually turned to Winston Churchill. Hey, Churchill, we need you to save the day, okay, for us. You need to get us out of this. And of course, Churchill, I imagine if I was Churchill, I'd be like, say it, you were right. But anyway, that's just me. Churchill comes into this literally with his country, falling down around his ears because German bombers are starting to appear over England a little bit. But now he's also got his army, and a sizable chunk of the French army, that's trapped in a pocket with the ocean at its back. They do manage to get these guys lifted off of the French and the Belgian coastline, and they manage to save the men, but they leave all their heavy equipment behind. All their tanks, all their artillery pieces, anything that they couldn't get on the ship with them is left behind in France and in Belgium. And of course, the Germans are going to get all of this stuff. And so the Germans are then going to turn on the rest of France, and they're going to take it over relatively easily over the course of 6 weeks. Okay. Hitler figured, well, hey, I've broken up, I've taken over Denmark, taken over Norway, taken over France, and so, all right, Britain, war's over. You guys, there's no reason for us to keep fighting. And of course, Churchill was like, no, we're going to fight you everywhere. We're not going to give up no matter what. What are you talking about? There's no reason for us to keep fighting. I mean, really, we don't have that much of a big beef with you guys. And of course, Churchill, no, we're not going to give up no matter what. But we control all of Western Europe. We got these huge armies now. We got all those resources. We will crush you. You're just this tiny little island all fighting by yourself. And of course, Churchill, bring it, punk. Okay, and okay, that's what we'll do. So the Germans now have to contemplate an invasion of England. The problem with this, though, is you can't just roll your tanks into England from France. There's a little thing called the ocean in between. The English Channel is going to prevent this. So what you've got to do is find a way to get the British Navy out of the way. The German Navy's probably not really up to the task. But as we've seen, planes can bomb ships. And so the German Luftwaffe is going to have to get bomb the Royal Navy out of the way, and they're going to be pretty successful at trying to do that. But of course, they've also got to get the Royal Air Force out of the way, because they're not just going to sit there flying around. Oh, look, chaps, they're blowing up our ships. Wave to the Germans as they do that. They're going to have to fight these guys off too. So they're going to have to clear out both the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy. They do manage to get the Royal Navy out of the Channel during daylight hours at the height of this battle that takes place, but this real seesaw affair is going to depend on whether or not the German Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, can knock out the Royal Air Force. And all of this is going to be taking place here in the early autumn of 1940 that is referred to as the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain is the first battle fought in human history entirely in the air. No land forces come into contact with each other. The Germans, for their part in France, are building up a very large invasion fleet of ships, and they're finding ways to get their tanks across the ocean in that regard for what they refer to as Operation Sea Lion, right? Operation Sea Lion. But the Brits, on their part, they have time on their side, because as autumn gets later and later, the British Channel gets choppier and choppier. And so the time for invasion sort of slips away from Hitler, and now they're only, but Britain is safe for invasion, but really they're the only forces left that are opposing Adolf Hitler. So here you can see, this is the breakthrough at Sedan, and the Allies, they go into here, and they get caught in this pocket around the French and Belgian border, where they will eventually be forced to be pulled out in a place called Dunkirk. And here you can see the city of Dunkirk is on fire as these guys are getting in their ships. The shells are coming down all over the place, so they do manage to get away, but the rest of Paris is going to fall to German forces. And these are German forces, these Nazi troops. They're marching through the Champs-Élysées, the Arc de Triomphe here in Paris, and you can see the reaction of the French citizens. They're crying. Their country's been conquered. Okay, you can imagine our response if our country were to be taken over by someone else. And so one of the popular hotspots for German soldiers in World War II when they were on leave was to go to Paris and have your picture taken in front of the Eiffel Tower. So there's Adolf Hitler, and there's Uncle Adolf again with his entourage of military commanders, and he was pretty elated. He had conquered France in 6 weeks whereas Germany in World War I had tried to conquer France in 4 years and had failed to do it. And so this is a big shift. The fighting would eventually devolve to the skies over Great Britain, and these pilots from the RAF, they managed to hold on by the skin of their teeth. In some cases, these guys would go up, they'd be flying their Hawker Hurricane or their Spitfire, and they would be fighting these Germans and shoot one down, and then they'd get shot down, they'd come down to some field, they'd hitch a ride back to the airbase, and then by the afternoon they're back up in another plane and they're fighting until they could barely keep their eyes open. Churchill had said, that we're going to fight these guys on the beaches, we're going to fight them in the sky, we're going to fight them everywhere. And then once it was pretty obvious that the Battle of Britain was over and that Britain wasn't going to be invaded, he said about these pilots, these men in the Royal Air Force, that never in the course of human history has so many owed so much